The night was shrouded in darkness, and the wind howled through the trees as David, a weary traveler, drove down a desolate highway. Rain poured down in sheets, making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. He had been on the road for hours, and his eyes were heavy with exhaustion. His only solace was the soothing sound of the rain against the roof of his car. As he navigated the winding road, his headlights suddenly caught the figure of a woman, drenched and shivering, standing at the side of the highway. Her thumb was out, signaling her desire for a ride. David slowed his car and pulled over, his heart pounding with sympathy. He rolled down the window, the rain quickly pelting his face, and called out, "Need a lift?" The woman, with long, wet hair clinging to her face, nodded gratefully and climbed into the passenger seat. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice trembling with relief. "I've been waiting out there for hours, and I was starting to lose hope." David couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the woman. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with tired eyes and a pale complexion. She introduced herself as Emily and explained that her car had broken down several miles away, leaving her stranded in the pouring rain. As they continued down the dark and winding highway, Emily told David about her life. She was a college student, returning from a late-night class when her car had given out on her. David was an excellent listener, and he couldn't help but be drawn into her story. Emily was charming, and the conversation flowed easily between them. The rain showed no sign of letting up, and the night was growing darker. David offered to drop Emily at the nearest gas station, but she insisted that he take her to her home, which was just a few miles away. He agreed, wanting to make sure she arrived safely. After a few more minutes of driving, Emily directed him to a quiet, tree-lined street. The houses were old and weathered, and the streetlights cast eerie shadows across the pavement. David parked the car in front of a small, decrepit house. Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you so much for the ride. You've been a lifesaver." David smiled, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "You're welcome. I'm just glad I could help. Do you have everything you need to get inside?" She nodded, reaching for the door handle. "Yes, I have my keys right here. Thank you again, David." As Emily stepped out of the car and into the pouring rain, David watched her rush toward the house. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, happy that he had been able to help a stranger in need. He watched the house from his car for a few moments, making sure she got inside safely. But as he waited, an eerie feeling washed over him. The house seemed deserted, and there were no lights on inside. He couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that something wasn't right. David decided to check on Emily one last time. He opened the car door and made his way toward the house, trying to shield himself from the relentless rain. He reached the front door and knocked loudly, but there was no response. Puzzled, he knocked again, calling out, "Emily, are you okay? It's David, the guy who gave you a ride." Still, there was no answer. The house remained silent and dark, as if it had been abandoned for years. David's sense of unease grew, and he began to fear the worst. He called out once more, then turned the doorknob and pushed the door open gently. It swung open, revealing an empty, dusty interior. The house was abandoned, its rooms filled with cobwebs and aged, rotting furniture. There was no sign of Emily or anyone else. David's heart raced, and he felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew he had seen Emily enter this house, and now she had vanished without a trace. He stepped back outside, his clothes soaked from the rain, and scanned the area for any sign of her. But there was nothing, just the empty street and the pouring rain. It was as if she had never existed. David couldn't understand what had just happened. He was filled with a sense of dread, as if he had stumbled upon something he was never meant to see. The rain continued to pour, and he felt as though he had entered a world of uncertainty and fear. He returned to his car and tried to shake off the bizarre encounter. Maybe Emily had simply found shelter in a neighbor's house, and he had misunderstood the situation. But as he drove away, the feeling of unease lingered. Weeks passed, and David couldn't forget the night he had given a ride to Emily. He couldn't shake the memory of her mysterious disappearance. He decided to do some research, asking around about the small abandoned house on the quiet street. The locals were reluctant to talk about it, but David managed to piece together a story. The house had been empty for years, and it was rumored to be haunted. Some claimed it was the site of a tragedy, where a young woman had died under mysterious circumstances. The more David dug, the more he realized that the story of Emily was far from unique. He discovered that others had encountered a young woman on that same dark highway in the pouring rain and had given her a ride, only to have her vanish into thin air. She was always described as being wet and cold, and she always asked to be taken to the same abandoned house. David couldn't ignore the similarities between these stories and his own experience. He couldn't help but wonder if he had encountered the infamous Vanishing Hitchhiker, a ghostly figure who appeared on lonely highways in the dead of night, seeking a ride to an abandoned house, only to disappear without a trace. Haunted by the enigmatic encounter, David returned to the small, eerie street where he had dropped off Emily. He parked his car and approached the abandoned house once more, his heart pounding with trepidation. The rain was pouring down, the darkness enveloping him. He knocked on the door, just as he had before, but this time he was met with an unexpected sound, a faint, eerie whispering coming from inside the house. It was a voice, soft and distant, carrying an air of despair. David pushed the door open and stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the dim interior. The house appeared to be empty, but the whispering continued, growing louder with each step he took. As he ventured further into the house, the whispers coalesced into a mournful cry. It was Emily's voice, filled with sorrow and anguish. David followed the sound, which seemed to lead him to a room at the end of the hallway. The room was draped in darkness, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. David's flashlight beam fell upon a full-length mirror, its surface cracked and stained with age. In the reflection, he saw her, Emily, her eyes hollow and empty, her body drenched and shivering. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling as if trying to break free from the confines of the mirror. Her lips moved, forming words that David couldn't hear, but he could read her desperate plea in her eyes. As David stared at the mirror in horror, the room seemed to grow colder, and the whispers became a deafening, mournful cry. He felt as though the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurring, and he was being drawn into an eerie, otherworldly realm. Suddenly, Emily's reflection was replaced by a different face, one that was even more haunting. It was the face of the vanishing hitchhiker, her eyes hollow and her expression filled with sorrow. She reached out with her spectral hand, her fingers transforming into a long, bony hook. David turned and fled from the room, his heart pounding and his mind filled with terror. He couldn't escape the feeling that he had crossed a threshold into a world of the supernatural, a realm where the living and the dead intersected. As he left the abandoned house and returned to his car, he knew that he had become a part of the legend, a witness to the vanishing hitchhiker's haunting existence. He couldn't forget the encounter, and the memory of Emily's mournful cries would continue to haunt his dreams, a reminder of the eerie encounter that had forever changed his perception of reality. The legend of the vanishing hitchhiker would continue to be whispered in hushed tones, a chilling story of encounters with a spectral traveler who sought refuge on lonely highways in the dead of night. For David, it was a story that had become all too real, a nightmarish journey into the unknown, where the living and the dead converged in a realm of haunting mystery and fear.